age doesn't stop the death penalty. In U.S. history, a handful of prisoners faced execution well into their late 60s, 70s, and even 80s. Their final words and last meals show the heavy weight of time and justice colliding at the very end. Before we dive into these chilling stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more true crime breakdowns. Hit the notification bell so you never miss the next episode. Walter Moody, Walter Leroy Moody Jr., his crimes date back to the late 1980s, when he orchestrated one of the most shocking acts of domestic terrorism in U.S. history. In December 1989, he mailed a series of pipe bombs that killed U.S. Circuit Judge Robert Vance at his home in Birmingham, Alabama, and civil rights attorney Robert Robinson in Savannah, Georgia. The bombings also injured others, including Vance's wife, who survived but was badly hurt. Moody's motivation was a twisted combination of revenge and hatred. He had long held a grudge against the judicial system after a 1972 conviction for possessing a pipe bomb. When appeals failed, his resentment grew into violent retaliation. He meticulously crafted explosive devices and sent them through the mail, directly targeting figures in the legal community. The attacks rattled not only Alabama, but also the entire country's justice system, showing how vulnerable even high-ranking officials could be. Moody was convicted in federal court in 1991 and sentenced to 7 life terms plus 400 years. Later, in 1996, an Alabama state court sentenced him to death for Judge Vance's murder. His appeals stretched across decades, but eventually the U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene, clearing the path for his execution. Last meal. Unlike many death row inmates who use their final meal request as a moment of indulgence or symbolism, Walter Moody declined a special last meal. Instead, he ate whatever the prison cafeteria served that evening. This decision reflected either resignation, indifference, or perhaps a desire not to give the state the satisfaction of a ritualized Last Supper. Reports suggest he had nothing remarkable, just the same food offered to the general prison population. Last words on April 19, 2018. At Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, Walter Moody was executed by lethal injection. At 83 years old, he became the oldest prisoner executed since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. When asked if he had any final statement, Moody refused to speak. He chose complete silence as the drugs entered his system. Witnesses described the execution as unusually quiet. He neither protested nor asked for forgiveness. After nearly 3 decades of fighting appeals and maintaining his stance, Moody left this world without offering any closure, apology, or final reflection. John Nixon. John B. Nixon Sr. was once a decorated World War II veteran, a man who had served his country in its time of need. But decades later, his life took a darker turn that ended in one of the most notorious murder-for-hire cases in Mississippi. In 1985, Nixon was paid $1,000 to kill a woman named Virginia Tucker at her home in Rankin County. The motive was tied to her estranged husband, who had allegedly orchestrated the plan. Nixon carried out the killing by shooting Tucker in front of her children, an act that horrified the community and underscored the cold, calculated nature of contract killings. During the investigation, Nixon's involvement became clear, and in 1986, he was convicted of capital murder. He was sentenced to death while his accomplices received long prison terms. His appeal stretched for nearly 20 years, raising issues about his age, health, and even his military service, but courts ultimately upheld the sentence. By the time of his execution in December 2005, Nixon was the oldest person put to death in the United States since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. As his execution date neared, Nixon was offered the traditional choice of a final meal. He requested a Southern-style dinner that reflected both his roots and his generation: fried catfish, hush puppies, French fries, and a salad. Unlike some prisoners who chose extravagant or symbolic meals, Nixon's request was humble and familiar, something that might have been found at any small-town diner in Mississippi. Last words. On December 14, 2005, Nixon was executed by lethal injection at the Mississippi State Penitentiary in Parchman. When asked for his final statement, Nixon chose to acknowledge both his faith and his failings. He quoted scripture and admitted to the weight of his mistakes, saying, I'm a man who has made mistakes, and I am sorry for the things I have done. Those words were far from a detailed confession, but they offered a rare glimpse of remorse, something not every death row inmate chooses to express. Witnesses said Nixon appeared calm as the drugs were administered, his voice steady as he spoke his final words. James Barney Hubbard. James Barney Hubbard's criminal history stretched across decades, marking him as one of Alabama's most notorious repeat offenders. His first conviction came in 1957 when he shot and killed a man during what he claimed was a drunken argument. For that crime, he received a 20-year sentence but was released after serving only a fraction of his time. Just a few years after his release, Hubbard committed an even darker act. In 1977, while still on parole for the first murder, he killed 62-year-old Lillian Montgomery in Tuscaloosa. Montgomery was a kind woman who had befriended Hubbard and even allowed him to live in her home. That trust was repaid with betrayal. Hubbard shot her in the head during an argument. Investigators later discovered he had planned to rob her. The case shocked the community, not only because of the brutality of the crime, but also because Hubbard had already proven violent and yet was out on parole. His conviction for Montgomery's murder resulted in a death sentence. What followed was an astonishingly long series of appeals, lasting nearly 3 decades, during which Hubbard became one of the longest-serving death row inmates in the country. By the time his appeals were exhausted, he was frail, in a wheelchair, and suffering from numerous health issues. Last meal on the evening of his execution at Holman Prison in Atmore, Alabama, Hubbard was offered the traditional choice of a final meal. He requested a fairly standard plate: a steak, a baked potato, a salad, and a roll. It wasn't extravagant, but it reflected a desire for a hearty, filling dinner, the kind of meal he might have enjoyed outside prison walls in ordinary life. Last words on August 5, 2004, Hubbard was led to the execution chamber. At 74 years old, he was the oldest person executed in Alabama since the death penalty's reinstatement in 1976. When asked for his last words, Hubbard gave no lengthy speech or apology. Instead, he mumbled quiet prayers to himself as the lethal drugs were administered. Witnesses reported that his words were inaudible, a faint murmur that seemed more like private prayer than a public statement. Clarence Ray Allen. Clarence Ray Allen's case is one of the most infamous examples of how crime can reach far beyond prison walls. In the early 1970s, Allen was already living a criminal lifestyle in California, involved in burglary and theft. In 1974, he was convicted of arranging the murder of Mary Sue Kitts, a 17-year-old who had discovered Allen's involvement in a grocery store burglary. Fearing she would expose him, Allen ordered her strangled and dumped in a canal. For this crime, he received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. But prison did not end Allen's criminal reach. From behind bars, he orchestrated even deadlier violence. In 1980, Allen feared that witnesses from the Kitts case might testify against him. He contacted an associate outside prison and ordered a hit on several individuals. The result was a massacre at Franz Market in Fresno, where 3 people, Brian Schledowitz, Douglas White, and Josephine Rocha, were shot and killed. The murders shocked the community not only for their brutality, but also because they were ordered by a man already serving a life sentence. Allen was later tried, convicted, and sentenced to death for the triple murders. His appeals stretched for decades, but the weight of the evidence and the cold-blooded planning behind the crimes left little room for mercy in the courts. By the time of his execution, Allen had spent more than 23 years on death row. Last meal on his final day at San Quentin State Prison, Clarence Ray Allen chose a meal that reflected indulgence and comfort. He requested buffalo steak, a rare choice compared to the typical prison last meal requests, alongside KFC fried chicken, a quart of whole milk, and a slice of pecan pie. The unusual combination suggested a mix of nostalgia and personal favorites, a last indulgence after decades of prison food. Last words on January 17, 2006, Clarence Ray Allen was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin, making him the oldest inmate executed in California since the death penalty was reinstated. Strapped to the gurney, Allen delivered a lengthy and emotional final statement. He said, "My last words will be, God bless you all. "I forgive everyone involved in my death penalty. You can't kill a warrior. I live forever." His words were defiant, blending forgiveness with a sense of self-mythology, as though he wanted to be remembered as more than just a criminal. Witnesses noted that despite his age and physical frailty, he was nearly blind, diabetic, and confined to a wheelchair. His voice carried with strength and conviction until the very end. Joe Nathan James Jr. Joe Nathan James Jr.'s crime was rooted in obsession and violence that spiraled fatally out of control. In 1994, James murdered his former girlfriend, 26-year-old Faith Hall, in Birmingham, Alabama. Hall had ended the relationship, but James continued to stalk and harass her. Despite her attempts to distance herself and move forward, he refused to let go. On August 15, 1994, James confronted Hall outside a friend's apartment. After forcing his way inside, he fatally shot her 3 times in front of witnesses. The killing was not only brutal, but also deeply traumatic for Hall's family and friends, who had long worried about James's threatening behavior. In 1996, James was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. His conviction was later overturned on appeal, but at a retrial in 1999, he was again found guilty and sentenced to death. For nearly 3 decades, he pursued appeals in both state and federal courts, but all were ultimately denied. What made James's case particularly controversial was the stance of Faith Hall's family. By the time his execution date approached in 2022, Hall's daughters and brother had publicly opposed the death penalty for James. They argued that killing him would not bring them healing or closure, and they petitioned Alabama's governor to commute his sentence. Their pleas were denied, and the execution went forward despite their objections, a rare and striking dynamic in capital punishment cases. Last meal. When offered the traditional choice of a final meal, Joe Nathan James Jr. declined. Instead, he ate whatever the prison cafeteria provided that day. His refusal could be seen as a statement of indifference or resignation, though he gave no reason. Unlike some inmates who request lavish meals as symbolic farewells, James chose to leave the ritual unmarked. Last words: on July 28, 2022, James was executed by lethal injection at Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama. At 71 years old, he was one of the oldest people executed in the modern history of the United States. When asked if he wished to make a final statement, James declined. He remained silent as the execution began, offering no apology, no words of faith, and no explanation. Witnesses described the room as heavy with tension, particularly because Faith Hall's family, who had begged for his life to be spared, were present to witness his death despite not wanting it carried out. Adding to the controversy, reports later emerged that the execution itself may have been botched. Witnesses said the process of establishing IV lines took unusually long, delaying the procedure by several hours. This fueled further criticism of Alabama's execution protocols, already under scrutiny. These men lived decades on death row, some outlasting the average inmate by decades. Yet when their time came, most met it with silence, prayer, or words of forgiveness. Their cases remind us how the death penalty intersects with age, health, and the long wait for justice in America. If you found this video insightful, make sure to subscribe for more chilling deep dives into last meals and final words. Drop a comment below. Which of these executions shocked you the most? Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more haunting stories from death row.